Perth, Western Australia, August 15th, 2020, midnight. The suburb was shrouded in darkness, with only the occasional flicker of streetlights casting faint glows on the empty road. A house on the outskirts stood quiet and still, but inside, there was a muffled commotion. In the dim light of a single lamp, weak shadows danced across the walls, accompanied by raised voices. It wasn't just an argument. It was something more, something intense and unsettling, almost primal in its ferocity. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the air, as if something heavy had slammed against the wall. Then came the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. Time seemed to freeze. The silence that followed was deafening, filling the space like a thick fog. Outside the house, there wasn't a soul in sight. No one witnessed the scene, but the sharp crack of the firearm pierced the stillness of the night, as if slicing through it like a shard of glass. Minutes after the gunshot, Perth police received a frantic call to the emergency services. A woman's voice, trembling and panicked, reported a shooting and said someone had been injured. "He's not moving! Oh my God, help!" the woman screamed, her voice breaking. The dispatcher immediately sent a patrol unit, and officers arrived at the scene within minutes. The flashing lights revealed a woman standing on the front lawn, visibly shaken. She was pale, her eyes wide with terror, and her whole body trembled uncontrollably. Inside the house, chaos awaited the officers. In the living room lay the body of James Watson, 38 years old. His body was twisted in an unnatural position, his eyes wide open, and a dark pool of blood had begun spreading across the floor. The blood soaked into the carpet, staining the furniture and walls. The officers quickly noticed signs of a struggle. Chairs were overturned, and there were clear marks of impact on both the furniture and the walls. The entire room was in disarray, pointing to a violent confrontation before the shot was fired. Next to the body lay a shotgun, its barrel pointed towards the door. At first glance, it seemed like someone had broken into the house, but there were no signs of forced entry. Officers cordoned off the area and called for detectives and forensic teams to collect evidence. It was clear to them that this wasn't just a random crime. There was something far more complex behind it. The woman they found on the lawn was identified as Catherine Watson, James's wife. She was in shock, and paramedics on the scene tried to calm her down. Her hands were covered in blood, and she was too distraught to speak coherently. When she was brought to the police station, all she could say was, "I didn't mean to. I didn't know it would end like this." Investigators began their search for answers. The first step was questioning the neighbors, but no one had heard anything unusual before the gunshot. One neighbor, an elderly man named Mark Ridley, mentioned that he saw Catherine and James returning home together that evening. They looked tense, but he didn't think much of it. Police took down his statement, though it didn't provide any significant leads. Meanwhile, forensic experts inside the house uncovered more and more evidence, suggesting that the conflict had started long before the gunshot. On the kitchen table, they found an open envelope. Inside were several documents and photographs. At first, they didn't seem particularly important, but upon closer inspection, the investigators noticed that some of the photos captured personal moments from the family's life. These images could potentially hold the key to understanding the motive behind the incident. Detectives worked to piece together the events of that evening. Around 8 p.m., Catherine and James returned home after a tense dinner at a restaurant. According to those who knew them, the dinner had been uncomfortable, but nothing had hinted at the coming tragedy. At one point, James mentioned that he needed to leave and take care of something, but Catherine insisted he stay. She told him there was something they needed to discuss. When they got back home, Catherine suggested they relax with a drink and spend the evening quietly. She left James in the living room and went upstairs, taking the envelope with her. James, seemingly unaware of what was coming, stayed downstairs. Catherine eventually came back down the stairs, holding the documents tightly in her hands, her face expressionless. She placed the envelope on the table in front of him and stood there, waiting for his reaction. James saw the envelope and his expression changed. He tried to remain calm, but the tension in the room was undeniable. Catherine didn't say a word, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. A heavy silence hung in the air. This was the moment when everything shifted. A heated argument erupted between them, escalating quickly into a shouting match. At one point, James tried to grab the envelope, but Catherine held onto it, refusing to let go of the documents. As investigators examined the room where the shot was fired, they discovered a broken chair that appeared to have been used as a weapon. Scattered across the floor were papers and photographs, some of which were stained with blood. All the evidence pointed to a struggle over the documents between James and Catherine. Detectives concluded that the shot was fired at the moment when James was trying to take something from Catherine. It was clear from the marks on the carpet and the position of the shotgun that Catherine had pulled the trigger. When police accessed James and Catherine's phones, they uncovered several intriguing details. James's phone had been turned off at 10:30 p.m., which was unusual considering his typical behavior. Surveillance footage from a camera outside their house confirmed that James had left around that time, but returned just 10 minutes later. What he did during those few minutes remained a mystery. Catherine, still in shock when she was brought to the station, couldn't provide a clear explanation of what had transpired. According to her, they had started arguing, and at some point, things spiraled out of control. She claimed not to remember how she ended up holding the shotgun. Detectives noted the stress she was clearly under, but they also sensed there was more to her story. Investigators began digging deeper into the Watsons' relationship. The couple had been married for 10 years, had no children, and outwardly appeared to have a calm life. However, neighbors pointed out that James had been spending less time at home in recent months, which had raised suspicions for Catherine. No one knew the exact nature of what was going on between them, but the tension in their interactions hadn't gone unnoticed by close friends and neighbors. The investigation also revealed that just a week before the incident, Catherine had contacted a private investigator. The reasons for this were unclear. Perhaps she was gathering evidence against her husband, but exactly what she was investigating was still unknown. Later that evening, police received the results of the forensic analysis of the weapon found at the scene. James's fingerprints were discovered on the shotgun, but they seemed odd, like he had only handled it briefly. This led detectives to wonder, could someone else have used the weapon in the critical moment? The morning after the incident, Perth police returned to Catherine and James Watson's home. The crime scene remained sealed off, with forensic teams continuing to gather evidence, while detectives worked to piece together a clearer picture of what had occurred. On the surface, it appeared to be a sudden outburst of aggression during an argument, but the details raised doubts about the simplicity of this explanation. Detective Richard Hale, leading the investigation, decided to review the surveillance footage again to make sure nothing had been overlooked. The footage showed James leaving the house at 10:30 p.m. and returning 10 minutes later, but there was a small inconsistency between the frames. The video showed him speaking with someone in a car parked by the curb. The camera captured a shadowy figure, but the face of the person James was talking to was indistinguishable. Hale realized this might be a crucial lead and began investigating who could have been outside the house at that moment. Meanwhile, detectives continued their second round of questioning with Catherine, but her mental state remained unstable. She insisted that she couldn't recall how things escalated and claimed everything happened too quickly. Her words were jumbled, and her eyes appeared vacant. However, Detective Hale noticed a brief change in her expression when he asked about the car seen on the surveillance footage, as if she was trying to hide something. At the same time, investigators were thoroughly examining the contents of the envelope found at the scene. Inside were indeed several photographs taken by a private investigator. The photos showed James with a young woman, but her face was always obscured. The report from the investigator detailed several places where they had met: a cafe in downtown Perth, a shopping mall parking lot, and a motel on the outskirts of the city. However, the woman's name wasn't mentioned in the report. Hale concluded that Catherine had hired the private investigator to follow her husband, but how these photographs tied into the crime was still unclear. Investigators decided to visit the office of the private investigator mentioned in the report. They found him, a man named Thomas Morgan, who looked somewhat uneasy when he saw the detectives. Morgan confirmed that Catherine had contacted him about 2 weeks prior, saying her husband had been acting suspiciously. She suspected he was being unfaithful but didn't provide many details. Morgan showed the detectives copies of the photos taken during a week of surveillance. The images clearly showed James meeting with the woman. Though her face was always hidden, she was either turning away or wearing a hood. Morgan claimed he had handed over all the gathered material to Catherine just a day before the tragic event. Detective Hale returned to Catherine and showed her the photos taken by the private investigator. Her reaction remained emotionless, but she admitted that she had suspected James of being unfaithful. She said she intended to confront him with the evidence at a family discussion to find out the truth and decide the future of their marriage. However, she maintained that she never meant to harm him. According to her, things spiraled out of control when James saw the photos and accused her of spying on him. She claimed that the argument turned into a physical struggle and, eventually, the fatal shot. But she couldn't remember exactly how it happened. As detectives tried to determine whether Catherine's account was truthful, they received the forensic results on the fingerprints found on the shotgun. While James's prints were indeed present, forensic experts determined they had been placed on the gun well before the shot was fired. Catherine had claimed the gun was kept in the house for protection and insisted she had never touched it. This statement contradicted the forensic findings, and investigators began to suspect that someone had tampered with the weapon in an attempt to mislead the police. The surveillance footage of James talking to someone in a car became a key piece of evidence. Detective Hale sent a copy of the recording for further analysis, hoping to identify the car's license plate and figure out who might have been outside the Watsons' home that evening. While waiting for the results, detectives reviewed Catherine and James's phone records, searching for additional clues. They discovered that on the night of the incident, Catherine had sent several text messages to her sister Lisa. The content of the messages raised suspicions. They seemed like attempts to explain or justify something. One message read, "I didn't mean for it to happen this way." Another contained a request to meet. Lisa hadn't replied to these messages, which alarmed Hale. He decided to call her in for questioning to find out if she knew anything about that night's events. When Lisa arrived at the station, she appeared tense. She confirmed that she had spoken with Catherine the day before, but not on the night of the incident. According to Lisa, they had discussed an upcoming family gathering. She claimed to know nothing about what had happened and said she had been home the entire evening. However, her nervous demeanor and hesitant answers raised red flags for the detectives. Hale decided to check her phone records and location data to verify her alibi. While the questioning continued, investigators received the results from the analysis of the surveillance video. The license plate on the car parked outside the Watsons' house belonged to Lisa. This revelation heightened their suspicions, and Hale changed his approach during the interrogation, asking Lisa direct questions about her whereabouts that night. At first, she tried to make excuses, but under pressure, she finally admitted that she had been outside the house when James stepped out. Her explanation, however, was confusing. She claimed she had come to talk to her sister but decided to leave after seeing James, without ever getting out of the car. Hale knew something didn't add up. He returned to analyzing Lisa's phone records and discovered that on the night of the incident, she had received a message from James, urging her to come over immediately. But why would James call Lisa when he was supposed to be with Catherine, and what could they have been discussing privately? Meanwhile, forensic experts found another crucial piece of evidence. In the bedroom where Catherine said the argument began, they discovered traces of blood on the door handle that didn't match Catherine or James. This led detectives to suspect that a third person had been present during the conflict. A DNA analysis confirmed that the blood belonged to Lisa. Now, investigators had proof that Lisa had been inside the house, despite her previous denials. The police confronted Lisa with the new evidence. She tried to defend herself, claiming she had only come to protect Catherine, but when the argument between James and Catherine started, she panicked and tried to leave. She insisted she had no involvement in the crime and didn't know who fired the shot. However, her story became increasingly tangled as the questioning continued. Detectives were beginning to suspect that Catherine and Lisa might be hiding something. They had a theory that James's possible affair could have triggered a conflict between the sisters, but there were still too many unanswered questions. Hale decided to temporarily let Lisa go, asking her not to leave town. He sensed they were close to solving the mystery, but one key piece of evidence was still missing to fully uncover the truth about that night. The next day, Detective Richard Hale and his team returned to the Watson home for a more thorough inspection. With each new clue, it became clear that this wasn't a simple crime. Hale felt there was much more beneath the surface than just a family argument that ended in tragedy. The police combed through every room again, checking for details that might shed more light on the case. They closely examined the photographs found in the envelope. The detectives believed the private investigator's photos, commissioned by Catherine, were central to the motive, but the woman's face in the pictures remained blurred and hidden. This complicated the investigation, as they couldn't definitively identify her. While the forensic team continued their work, Hale decided to bring Lisa back in for questioning, this time not as a witness, but as a potential suspect. Lisa appeared nervous, but agreed to cooperate. Hale chose to use a more direct approach, presenting her with the results of the blood analysis found on the door handle. He asked her why her blood was found inside the house if she had claimed she never got out of her car. Lisa once again tried to explain, but her answers were unconvincing. She suggested she might have accidentally scratched herself while entering the house, but her story seemed flimsy. Hale realized that pushing further wouldn't be productive and decided to give her some time, though he was certain there was more to her story than she was letting on. Meanwhile, investigators analyzed Lisa and James's phone records. They found several messages James had sent to Lisa just before his death. One text read, "Come over immediately," while another specified the location for a meeting. The messages had an urgent, almost desperate tone, leading Hale to believe that James had a sense something serious was about to happen. He instructed his team to dig deeper into their past interactions to see if there had been other similar meetings or communications. Detectives also began reviewing James's emails and social media accounts. They uncovered a string of messages between James and Lisa dating back several weeks. In these exchanges, James and Lisa discussed some serious steps that needed to be taken soon. The messages hinted at a plan, but the specifics were vague. Hale started to piece together that there was more to the relationship between James and Lisa than just a family bond. As the investigation gained momentum, Catherine remained in a state of stress. Detectives decided to return to her for further questioning, hoping to clarify the events of that night. Hale began asking about her relationship with Lisa, but Catherine was reluctant to discuss her sister. She mentioned that they had been close, but their relationship had deteriorated in recent months. Catherine didn't go into details, but hinted that conflicts had arisen in their family, not all of which involved James. Sensing an opportunity, Hale pressed harder, asking if Catherine knew that James had been meeting with Lisa. He showed her messages from James's phone, but her reaction remained neutral. She claimed she had no knowledge of these meetings and that her only suspicion was about James possibly being unfaithful with another woman, but not with Lisa. At that moment, Hale realized that either Catherine truly knew nothing, or she was deliberately hiding the truth. Shifting their focus, the detectives decided to investigate Lisa's home. They obtained a search warrant and headed to her residence to gather more evidence. During the search, they found a notebook filled with notes about meetings and phone calls with James. The entries included names, dates, and addresses, one of which was Catherine and James's home. This confirmed that Lisa was not only aware of James's every move, but may have been planning her visits. Hale began to suspect that Lisa played a central role in what had happened. Further digging revealed a photograph in Lisa's house, showing her and James together at the beach. The picture appeared to be recent, and they looked quite close. This became a critical lead. Hale now realized that James and Lisa had a romantic relationship, one that Catherine either hadn't suspected or had intentionally ignored. Meanwhile, forensic experts completed their analysis of the shotgun. The results indicated that Lisa's fingerprints were indeed on the weapon, but they were left after James's prints. This led detectives to believe that Lisa had handled the shotgun after James was already injured. Hale began to suspect that Lisa might have tampered with the crime scene to mislead the investigation. At the same time, investigators uncovered footage from a hotel where James and Lisa had met. The video showed them talking, discussing something, before Lisa left and James stayed behind. Their behavior was intimate, providing further proof of a relationship that Catherine was unaware of. This strengthened the theory that Lisa and James were involved in something deeper, and that their secret connection had played a major part in the events leading to that tragic night. Hale decided to act quickly. He summoned Lisa back to the station and this time presented her with the new evidence: photos, videos, and fingerprints. Lisa tried to remain composed, but under pressure she began to crack. She admitted that she had indeed been seeing James behind Catherine's back. She explained that their affair had started over a year ago, but she never intended to destroy her sister's marriage. Everything was kept secret until Catherine began suspecting James of infidelity and hired a private investigator. Hale pressed further, asking what Lisa and James discussed that night. Lisa claimed that James had wanted to meet to talk about how best to confess the truth to Catherine, but things quickly got out of control. She confessed that she had come to the house but hadn't intended to interfere. However, when she heard the shouting, she entered the house and saw Catherine and James struggling. According to her, she tried to stop them but didn't make it in time. Detectives began verifying her story, but all the evidence pointed to Lisa being inside the house at the time of the crime. Surveillance footage, Blood analysis and fingerprints all confirmed her presence. The question remained, was she directly involved in the confrontation or merely a witness? But Hale was certain she was hiding more than she was letting on. Meanwhile, investigators examined James and Lisa's financial records. They discovered that shortly before the incident, James had transferred a large sum of money to Lisa's account. It seemed like payment for something, but the reason behind it remained unclear. Hale began to suspect that Lisa was involved in a larger plan, perhaps even orchestrating the crime. Later that evening, detectives received a breakthrough from the forensic team. They had found a phone belonging to Lisa, hidden under the mattress in Catherine and James's bedroom. When the detectives accessed the phone, they uncovered text messages that confirmed their suspicions. James and Lisa had been planning to stage an attack and frame Catherine for it. The messages discussed various details of the plan, but for some reason, things didn't go as intended. Hale realized they now had enough evidence to arrest Lisa. He ordered her detainment, and during a subsequent interrogation, Lisa, backed into a corner, admitted that there had indeed been a plan. She claimed that James had threatened to expose her if she didn't help him get rid of Catherine. However, she insisted that the shooting was an accident and that she never intended for things to go this far. Hale knew he was close to solving the case, but one key question remained. If Lisa and James had planned everything together, why did the plan fall apart? And who actually pulled the trigger? Detective Richard Hale felt like the pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, but one crucial question still lingered. Who had really pulled the trigger, and why had James and Lisa's plan gone wrong? The gathered evidence and Lisa's confession pointed to a conspiracy, but the full details were still unclear. In the interrogation room, Lisa continued to insist that she had no part in the crime and never intended to harm James. She tried to convince the detectives that their original plan was only to stage an incident that would make it look like Catherine had attacked James. But when the situation escalated, things spiraled out of control. According to her, when the struggle began, she found herself on the sidelines, unsure of what to do. Hale listened carefully, but he could tell that Lisa was still withholding something. He decided to launch one final review of the case to reconstruct the entire sequence of events from that night. The detectives returned to the Watson home, carefully reviewing surveillance footage and re-examining the crime scene to ensure they hadn't missed anything. During the re-examination, forensic experts uncovered a small but significant clue on the shotgun that had previously gone unnoticed. A strand of hair was found under the stock, and tests revealed it belonged to Catherine. This discovery gave Hale pause. Perhaps Catherine had held the gun either before or right after the shot was fired. It also explained why her account had been so confused. Maybe she genuinely couldn't remember how things unfolded in those critical moments when emotions ran high. The detectives also reviewed Catherine's phone records from just before the shooting. They discovered that she had contacted the private investigator she had hired and arranged a meeting for the next day. This confirmed that she had serious intentions of confronting the situation and possibly holding James accountable for his infidelity. But if she had these plans, why had the situation escalated into a tragedy? Hale decided to revisit Catherine's statements. His goal was to determine whether she had been manipulated, or if she had been involved in the conflict from the start. He began questioning her more assertively, but Catherine still claimed she couldn't recall the exact details. She described how she and James started arguing and how he tried to take the envelope with the photos from her. Everything happened too fast, and at some point, everything just went dark. As the investigation progressed, detectives gained access to a security camera in the living room that they had initially missed. It turned out James had installed the camera himself, providing an unexpected twist in the case. The footage showed Catherine and James arguing. Lisa didn't appear on camera, but her voice could be heard. She was pleading with James to stop and saying they needed to resolve things peacefully. At one point, James tried to snatch the envelope from Catherine's hands, and she pushed him away, sparking a physical struggle. The video showed Catherine losing control of the situation. James grabbed her wrists, and at that moment, Lisa ran into the room, attempting to break up the fight. She positioned herself between them, but somehow ended up holding the shotgun. It appeared she intended to de-escalate the situation, but things didn't go as planned. The video captured the crucial moment when Lisa, in a state of panic, unintentionally pointed the shotgun at James in an attempt to scare him. James made a sudden move, and that's when the gun went off. Catherine collapsed to the floor as Lisa stood frozen, the shotgun still in her hands. For several seconds, she stared at James lying motionless on the ground, her face contorted in pure horror. Slowly, she lowered the shotgun and ran out of the frame. Catherine, trembling and in shock, slowly got up and frantically dialed emergency services, her voice shaky and panicked. Detective Hale now understood what had happened. Lisa, caught in the middle of the escalating conflict, had fired the shot in a moment of sheer panic, likely not even realizing what she was doing. The plan that James and Lisa had concocted to stage an attack and pin the blame on Catherine had backfired. When the situation reached its breaking point, Lisa, overwhelmed by fear, lost control, and the tragedy became inevitable. Hale decided to conclude the case by charging Lisa with involuntary manslaughter. She broke down in tears, insisting that she never intended to cause harm, but the evidence was undeniable. The investigators recognized that, while her actions stemmed from panic, she had been aware she was holding a firearm and could have chosen not to use it. When Catherine learned the full truth, she remained in shock. She realized that her sister wasn't just a participant in the scheme, but the one whose actions had ultimately led to James's death. Despite her grief, Catherine agreed to cooperate with the investigation, providing all the necessary evidence to help the police bring the case to a close. In the end, Lisa pleaded guilty in court and was sentenced to 6 years in prison for involuntary manslaughter and conspiracy to stage a crime. Catherine left Perth to start a new life, determined to leave behind the tragic events that had forever altered her family. The story ended far differently than any of its participants had planned. Secret affairs, deception, and manipulation spiraled into a tragedy born from poor decisions and lost control.